Our scripture readings today began with the reading from Isaiah 25. This is part of a section of the book of Isaiah, which is called the Little Apocalypse of Isaiah. Apocalypse means a time of great judgment and a time of redemption, looking to the future. We did not read about the judgment piece of it, but you can't have deliverance without judgment. You can't have resurrection without death. And so this wonderful scene that is painted in Isaiah of this feast day, of this gathering of all the nations, all of the peoples of the world, to feast at the Lord's table, it can only happen after the death experience, the judgment experience that precedes it. So you all good Episcopalians are going to go home and read the part that precedes this, right? Yeah. So, Paul, who is the first writer of the New Testament, precedes the Gospel of Mark by at least 20 years, gives his account of the resurrection. And when you read his account, Jesus appeared to a large number of people. What does it say? At least 500 at one time? You don't get a record of that in the synoptic tradition, but this is Paul's version of it. But in contrast to that, what do we have at the Gospel of Mark's ending?
They don't tell him.
There's no appearance, and the women who see it, the women who are the first to see it, all they see is an empty tomb and an angel. Now let me just flag that for all of us here, that's all we get, is an empty tomb, and sometimes, if we're lucky, we might have an angelic vision. But how do they leave? In terror, in fright. So let me just invite you to think about a frightening experience that might be similar to what they experienced. Think back to a time, maybe recent, maybe back further, when somebody that you really dearly loved died. And they weren't torched, they were put in a casket. And the casket was put in the funeral home. And you were going to go there to the early visitation. You went a little early so you could be prepared. You come into the funeral home. The door is open. It's dark inside. Nobody greets you. And you go up to the casket. And it's empty. And an angelic figure appears and says, he or she is not here. Now, how many of you wouldn't be frightened with seeing that? That's scary stuff. We're not used to that in our everyday life. And that's precisely what happened to these women. It was scary stuff. But now, on top of that, who would believe the story of women? We're talking about patriarchy. We're talking about the only people who counted were men, not the stories of women. So it's no wonder that the following synoptic writers, Luke and Matthew, have to add on to the story, because it just shouldn't end right there. But I think the ending is really very pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about. So I want to begin with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When our daughter was young, I don't know if she was like 4th grade or something, we found the Narnia series, and over a long period of time read them every day. To read 7 books, it takes a while. We were living in Narnia Fantasyland for quite a while. But here in the first book is a wonderful account that parallels the resurrection story. It's in the chapter that's entitled Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. Now, just to remind you of this, the Wicked Witch was ruling Narnia, and everything was dark, everything was winter, Christmas never would come, and the 4 kids come on the scene through the wardrobe, and they begin to find out what's going on, and Aslan comes, and there's a beginning of a thaw of the land, and the sun begins to shine. And then Aslan encounters that Edmund, one of the Princey, whatever the kids were, had sort of wandered away and got into the web of the Wicked Witch. And he was going to be sacrificed for the rest of them. And Aslan made a deal that he would be sacrificed instead. And so, in the chapter preceding this, Aslan is killed. He is bound, he is muzzled on the great round stone table, and the witch, and surrounded by all of her people, have gathered around, mocked him, abused him, and finally killed him. So here's where the story begins. The girls, they take off the muzzle from Aslan, and then the little mice come along and they gnaw off all of the cords that were wrapping him. So the girls, that's Susan and Lucy, similar to the gospel story, cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looks more like himself without them. Every moment, his dead face looked nobler, and the light grew, and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quiet, definitely early morning now, not late night. I'm so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk about a bit. I'm not reading the whole thing. At that moment, they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant plate. What's that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The stone table was broke into 2 pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. Oh, cried the girls, running back to the table. Oh, it's too bad, sobbed Lucy. They might have left the body alone. Who's done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is it more magic? Yes, said a great voice behind them. It is more magic. They looked around. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen it before, Shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown back, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead, dear Aslan?" "Well, not now," said Aslan. You're not asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. "But what does it all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat more calm. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read then a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing person, victim, who has committed no treachery, was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack, and death itself would start working backwards, and now, and now. It's a beautiful story paralleling the gospel story. So I want to talk about this crack that changes everything from before to what follows. That's what this story of the resurrection is about. It's a crack. It's a definitive change that happens. So the first story that comes to my mind is Me Too. The women who were victims were silenced. Nobody would listen to their stories. And they kept their stories to themselves out of fear and out of the reality that they would continue to be oppressed. And a crack happened in the system. And women all over, not just in this country, but all over, began to say, "Me too, this has happened to me." And their voices has had a major impact on a deep wound of our culture, of our society. So a similar story is the youth from Parkland. The youth who finally said, "We've had enough. There's too much of guns and violence, and this has to change. We can't continue to have a society that worships guns and gives guns out and gives particularly assault weapons, which are meant only to kill people. We can't continue to have that." And their voices are beginning to be heard. Now, it's too early to tell what kind of impact, long-term impact, that will have on us as a people. But that's really what the resurrection story is about. It's about this radical change, this radical transformation. And it's a transformation that all of us can be a part of. Whatever we do, wherever we walk, we can be agents of change, or we can just go along with the status quo. We can go along with whatever is because it's too big, it's too immense. But the women who did Me Too, the youth at Parkland, they didn't take that track. They didn't say it was too big and too immense. They got in there and said, "We have to do something about that." This is what the resurrection story is. Amen.